Now he understood Hayes better, and he felt happier. Anne, now free from Kong, tried to find the way back to the ship. She saw smoke about 6 kilometers away. This is the right way back, she thought. Tired and dirty, she wanted to sit down, but she had to listen carefully. There were more dinosaurs. But where? Suddenly, there was a noise from behind her, and she turned around. "Is it Jack?" she hoped. 2 large, angry dinosaurs ran at her. Quickly, she jumped under an old tree. She pulled her legs under her so the dinosaurs couldn't get her with their big teeth. 2 more dinosaurs came from behind, and the 4 dinosaurs fought angrily. Anne jumped out and ran. But another, larger dinosaur came after her with a hungry look in its eyes. The dinosaur's mouth, with its big teeth, came nearer. Anne screamed. Before its teeth closed around her, she saw Kong's face behind the dinosaur. His great heavy hand broke the dinosaur's skull. Another dinosaur ran at them, but Kong killed it too. Anne watched Kong, and she felt happy and sad at the same time. "He saved me," she thought. "But will he take me back into the jungle, away from the smoke, away from the ship?" But when he finished, Kong didn't pick Anne up. He turned and walked away. Afraid, Anne looked around. How many dinosaurs are here? With Kong, I'm safe, she thought. So she followed him. He stopped and turned. He looked at Anne's face. Then he walked away again, but more slowly. Anne followed him, but suddenly the sound of guns stopped her. Angrily, Kong turned to the sound. He picked Anne up in his large hand and put her on the top of a very high rock. She couldn't get down and run away. Then Kong turned around and ran through the jungle to the sound of the guns, to the men. Anne couldn't stop him, and she couldn't help her friends. The ground moved under Kong's heavy feet, and she could hear him roar. Now she could only wait for Kong. "Please don't kill them," she thought. Chapter 5. Kong Saves Anne. "To this beautiful woman, I am an ugly giant." He looked at his hands, and then, with sad eyes, at Anne. The men followed Hayes to a giant ravine, thick with trees and vines. One very long-dead tree went across it at the top. It was their only bridge. "Okay, men, follow me," Hayes said. "Jimmy, stay right behind me." The dead tree was wet and dangerous. "Don't look down," he said. Very carefully, Carl carried his camera across the ravine. "Maybe now he'll lose that stupid camera," Hayes hoped. At the other end of their bridge, there were dark ruins and trees with thick, heavy vines. Hayes heard something. He stopped. Somebody or something was there. He could feel its eyes on him. "What is it?" Jimmy asked quietly. "Jimmy, maybe you'll have to turn around and run," said Hayes. "I'm not afraid," answered Jimmy. "I don't want you to die here, Jimmy," said Hayes. "What's in those ruins?" he thought. Two angry yellow eyes shone out of the dark ruins at him. "Go back!" Hayes shouted to the men behind him. They turned around quickly. Hayes shot into the ruins. Suddenly, the watcher jumped out at him. For the first time, Jack saw the giant gorilla. It was as tall as the trees, and it ran at Hayes. Its large hand picked him up. Jack's face went white. Jimmy couldn't leave Hayes. He wanted to help his friend. "No, Jimmy! Go back!" Hayes shouted. Hayes was unafraid, and he shot Kong in the face. Kong roared angrily. Jimmy and Jack, half the way across the bridge, turned and looked. Suddenly, Kong threw Hayes across the ravine. The men heard the sound when Hayes hit the north wall of the ravine hard. There was no question. He was dead. "No!" Jimmy cried. Kong roared. Jimmy's eyes were wet and very angry. He started to go for Kong. He wanted to kill him. Jack pulled Jimmy down onto the tree. Suddenly, Kong hit the tree with his heavy hand, and Jack and Jimmy fell. Quickly, they put out their hands and caught the vines on the tree. The vines stopped their fall, but it was a long way down to the bottom of the ravine. "We can't stay here, but we can't move," Jack thought wildly. Lumpy was almost safely across the bridge. Carl, too, was almost to the other end when he fell onto his stomach. His camera flew out of his hands and into the tree near Lumpy. "Get it, Lumpy!" he shouted. But Lumpy kicked the camera, and it fell into the ravine. Suddenly, Kong picked up the dead tree. Carl saw Jack and Jimmy with the vine in their hands, but he couldn't help them. The sailors on the tree tried not to fall, but then two men screamed. When they hit the bottom of the ravine, their skulls broke on the rocks. Then another man screamed and fell. Kong roared angrily and threw the tree into the ravine. Jack, Jimmy, Carl, and Lumpy went down with it. They fell into some thick, wet, brown water. It was strangely cold. The men were hurt, but not badly. 3 sailors were dead. Lumpy's best friend was one of them. Kong turned and walked away. Jack looked for Jimmy and found him in some vines. He put his arms around the young man, and Jimmy cried. Carl sat up and saw his camera on the rocks. He couldn't use it now. There was black film everywhere. Suddenly, some ugly underground animals climbed onto Lumpy's dead friend. Before Lumpy could move his friend away, 100 or more of these strange, ugly animals came up out of the ground. Jack and Jimmy tried to kill some of them, but there were too many. Lumpy screamed loudly. One of the animals had his head in its mouth, and then it ate him. More animals arrived before the loud sound of guns came from above. Bruce Baxter and Preston shot and killed a lot of the ugly things. The other animals ran away. Suddenly, there were more sailors above them with guns, and with them was Englehorn. Preston shouted, "Take the rope! I'll pull you up!" Jack helped Jimmy up, and then he went for Carl. He put the end of the rope in Carl's hands. Carl didn't look at him. He had a strange smile on his face. Englehorn pulled on the rope and helped Carl to the top of the ravine. Then he looked around him. "What did you do to my men?" he said angrily to Carl. "Why aren't you dead too?" He saw Jack across the ravine. Jack climbed to the top and walked away through the trees. "Stop, Driscoll! Don't be stupid!" Englehorn shouted. "I'll see you later," shouted Jack. "She's dead!" Englehorn shouted to him. Carl stood next to Englehorn and watched Jack. "She's not dead. Jack's going to bring her back to the ship," he said. Englehorn looked at Carl. Carl had a new plan, but what was it? "That gorilla will be right behind Jack, too," Carl said slowly. "We can win this game." "Are you planning to catch that gorilla and take it home?" Englehorn asked. He laughed at Carl's stupid idea. "You catch wild animals, and you have a lot of chloroform on the ship. We can use that," Carl said. "I don't think we can," answered Englehorn. "Jack, be careful!" Carl shouted to his old friend. "Don't close the door in the wall," Jack shouted back. "I won't," shouted Carl. After a minute, when Jack couldn't hear, he said quietly, "I'm sorry, Jack." Kong went back to Anne and took her down from the high rock. For the first time in this jungle, she felt strangely safe. He jumped across a ravine and then across a river. She was a small plaything between his large fingers. Then he stopped and put her down. She looked up, and high above her head was a statue of a giant gorilla. "That's you, Kong," she said. Kong looked at Anne, a very small person, and at the giant statue. He understood something for the first time. "To this beautiful woman, I am an ugly giant." He looked at his hands, and then, with sad eyes, at Anne. Slowly and carefully, he picked her up again and took her to a very high mountain. From up there, Anne could see the ship, only about 5 kilometers away. The orange sun slowly went down in the west. When Kong put Anne down, she saw the skull of a giant gorilla on the ground near her. Was this his mother's or his father's skull? Maybe his brother's or his wife's. Anne understood. He had nobody, and she was his only family now. Anne put her hand on Kong's arm, but he didn't look at her. She wanted to make him happy, so she danced for him, but he didn't look. "Look at me," she said. "Look." Slowly, he turned and put one finger in front of her. She put her arms around it, and he pulled her up. She looked across the jungle to the ocean. His eyes followed hers. "It's beautiful," she said. Kong looked into her pretty face. "Beautiful," she repeated slowly. He opened up his hand, and she climbed into it. With one large finger, he slowly felt her hair. She looked into his eyes, and she wasn't afraid. The light of day slowly changed to the dark of night on this mountain top, and the two of them sat quietly. Jack climbed carefully up the dangerous rocks to the top. When he got there, his eyes opened wide. There was Kong, asleep. But where was Anne? Slowly, Jack moved nearer to the giant animal. Up above, giant birds flew around and around in the night sky. Jack was near Kong's feet when he looked up at the gorilla's hand. His eyes opened wider than before. Anne was asleep in Kong's hand. He moved very slowly, and suddenly Anne's eyes opened. She was excited, but she didn't make a sound.